My name is Marcus Doyle, and I am 29 years old, and 6 months ago I signed a piece of paper that took 40 acres of Texas land away from the man who raised me since I was 11. At my father's memorial dinner, my stepfather Gerald stood up in front of the whole family and told everyone the ranch would finally be handled properly now that Robert was gone. I smiled, I nodded. Then I called a number I had been given 4 years earlier and said 3 words: "It's time now." The next morning, Gerald's real estate agent called him to say the sale he had already lined up for the north pasture could not go through. Gerald went pale in his own kitchen. My mother, who had already signed a listing agreement without telling me, called it a misunderstanding. Before I tell you what happened next, please hit like and subscribe. Drop your city and local time below. I love knowing where you're listening from. Now, let me take you back to 8 years ago, to a summer evening when my father said something I didn't understand until the night I read his will. The ranch smelled like cut hay and diesel, and, underneath that, like the leather of my father's work gloves, which he kept on a nail by the back door, no matter how many times my mother asked him to put them somewhere else. I was 21 that summer, home from college with no real plan, and my father, Robert Doyle, was the only person who never asked me what I was going to do with my life. He just handed me a shovel and said there was always something on 40 acres that needed fixing. The house we lived in belonged to Gerald, my mother's second husband, a man who had married her 4 years earlier and who talked about the ranch the way other men talk about a stock they're waiting to sell. But the 40 acres past the creek, the ranch itself, that was still my father's, land his own father had cleared by hand, land that had never once been mortgaged or divided. I remember the sound the screen door made, a single tired creak, and the way the porch boards were soft and grey under bare feet. I remember the taste of the sweet tea my father made too strong on purpose, and the particular quiet of that house at dusk, when the cicadas started up and nobody bothered turning on a light for another hour. I remember my father's hands, thick and cracked, closing my fingers around the handle of an old brass key that didn't fit any lock in the house. "This isn't for now," he said. "This is for whenever you need to remember whose land this is." I asked him what he meant. He just looked out at the fence line for a long moment and said, "People will tell you, paper doesn't mean anything. Don't believe them. Paper is the only thing that remembers what people forget." I didn't understand him then. I put the key in a drawer and went back to school 2 weeks later and didn't think about it again for years. Gerald was never cruel to my face. That's the thing people don't expect. Cruelty rarely announces itself. It shows up in small omissions. He'd talk about the property at dinner instead of your father's land. He'd mention, almost as a joke, that 40 acres sitting empty was dead money, the way another man might complain about a leaky faucet. He brought a surveyor out once, telling my mother it was just curiosity about the property line. My father watched him do it from the porch, said nothing, and later that night told me quietly, "Some men can't stand to watch something exist that isn't theirs yet." I remember thinking he was being harsh. I know better now. There was a night that same summer when my father grilled steaks on an old rusted pit behind the barn, just the two of us, because my mother and Gerald had gone into town for some event I wasn't invited to and didn't want to be. My father didn't say much while he cooked, just handed me a plate and told me to eat before it got cold, the way he always did. Partway through, he set his fork down and told me a story about his own father, about how the old man had refused a buyout offer from an oil company twice in the same decade because he said land you can walk isn't the same as land you can spend. "Money runs out," my father said. "Ground doesn't." I didn't think much of it at the time. I think about it constantly now. There was a particular Sunday that fall, the last one before I went back to school, when my father and I spent the whole afternoon resetting fence posts along the east line. He didn't talk much while we worked, which was normal for him, but at one point he stopped, wiped his hands on his jeans, and looked at me in a way I didn't understand until much later. "You're the only one who comes out here to fix something without being asked," he said. "Remember that about yourself." I laughed it off at the time. I thought he meant something small, about work ethic. Over that last summer he started getting tired earlier, coughing longer, and there was a particular smell in the house by August, rubbing alcohol, and the sharp, clean smell of a folder of paperwork he kept locked in his truck, which he never once let me see inside. I noticed it. I filed it away, without understanding why it mattered, the same way I filed away the brass key. My father was diagnosed that October, and gone by the following spring. Gerald cried at the funeral, and I don't doubt some of it was real, but I watched him shake hands with 3 different men from the county afterward. Men I later learned were land buyers, and he was already talking about next steps before the dirt had settled. My mother, grieving and exhausted, let him handle things, because that's what she always did. 2 weeks after the funeral, I came downstairs for water at 1 in the morning and heard Gerald on the phone in the kitchen, his voice low, businesslike, a voice I had never heard him use with my mother. "Once probate clears, there's nothing tying it up," he said. "The son's got no claim on paper. It's not like Robert left a will anybody's seen." He laughed at something the person on the other end said. "She'll sign whatever I put in front of her. She always does." I stood in the dark hallway and said nothing. I didn't confront him. I didn't wake my mother. I went back upstairs, sat on the edge of my bed, and thought about a brass key in a drawer, and for the first time in years, I understood that my father hadn't just been talking about a lock. That's the word they use for everything that used to be love: asset. I heard Gerald say it 3 more times that week, about the ranch, about my mother's savings, about a truck that used to be my father's favorite thing in the world. Asset. Nothing left over but the word. Even the way he spoke about my mother changed in those weeks, less like a wife and more like a co-signer he needed to keep agreeable. I started paying attention in ways I never had before. I mowed the pasture on weekends, kept the fence lines in good repair, made sure the well pump still worked, all without saying a word about why. To everyone else it looked like grief. It was something closer to maintenance. I was invisible to Gerald, in the way an adult stepson often is, background furniture, someone who'd eventually move on with his own life and stop being a variable in his plans. I decided that if he was going to underestimate me, I would let him. Invisibility, I realized, could be a kind of armor, as long as I used the time it bought me wisely. It was cleaning out the garage that November that I found the metal lockbox behind a shelf of paint cans, exactly where the brass key fit. Inside was a folder with my name on it in my father's handwriting, and a business card for a man named Arthur Pell, an estate attorney 2 counties over. I didn't call right away. I sat with the folder for 3 days before I opened it fully, partly out of fear of what it would say, partly because some part of me wanted to hold on to the last thing my father had left specifically for me before I knew what it meant. When I finally called Arthur Pell, he didn't sound surprised to hear from me. "I was wondering when you'd find that," he said. "Your father came to see me 4 years ago. He wanted this handled a very particular way." What Arthur explained to me over the next hour changed everything I thought I understood about my own family. My father had placed the 40 acres, not the house, just the ranch land itself, into an irrevocable trust the year Gerald married my mother, with me named as the sole beneficiary, to take effect immediately upon his death, with no probate required and no signature from anyone else needed to finalize it. It had already happened. Legally, the land had been mine since the morning my father died. Gerald's entire plan, the listing agreement, the survey, the buyer he already had lined up, was built on land he had never once had the right to sell. Arthur told me Gerald had approached him 8 months earlier, asking to review the estate, not knowing Arthur was the very attorney who drafted the trust that excluded him entirely. Arthur had said nothing. He was waiting for me to come find him, exactly as my father had instructed. "Your father knew exactly the kind of man Gerald was," Arthur said. "He just didn't want to fight him while he was alive. He wanted the fight to already be over by the time it started." He slid a second document across the desk, one my father had written by hand, and asked Arthur to keep with the trust paperwork rather than file publicly. It wasn't legal language. It was 3 short paragraphs, addressed to me, explaining in his own plain words why he'd done it this way. Not to punish Gerald, he wrote, but because he'd watched too many families destroy each other over land after the person who built it was gone, and he refused to let that happen to his son from beyond a grave he wouldn't be around to defend. I sat in my car outside Arthur's office for a long while, turning that over, before I texted him 2 words: "I'm ready." That night, 3 counties away, Gerald signed a listing agreement with a land agent for the North Pasture, using a legal description he'd copied off an old county map, on land that hadn't belonged to him for even a single day. He went to bed that night thinking he had finally solved a problem that never existed for him to solve. Have you ever had to stay silent to protect yourself even when every part of you wanted to speak up? Tell me in the comments. I read them. Arthur laid it out for me in plain terms over the following weeks. The trust was already recorded with the county. All I had to do was file a single notice, a formal assertion of the recorded interest, and Gerald's listing agreement would become legally void the moment the title company ran its search. There was no lawsuit needed, no fight, nothing dramatic. Just paperwork my father had already put in motion, waiting for the day I chose to file it. Gerald, meanwhile, had no idea any of this existed. He started being unusually warm to me that month, inviting me fishing for the first time in years, telling me he'd always thought of me like a son, offering to put my name on the truck title as a gesture of goodwill, timed suspiciously close to when the sale was supposed to close. One evening he sat across from me at the kitchen table with a beer he didn't finish and said, "Your dad would want this family taken care of, Marcus. That's all I'm trying to do here." He said it gently, almost convincingly, and for a half second I felt the old pull of wanting to believe him, wanting there to be a version of this where he was simply a tired man trying his best. Then I remembered the voice I'd heard in that kitchen at 1 in the morning, low and businesslike, talking about signatures and probate like they were levers on a machine. I let him talk. I said, "I'll think about it," and watched his face relax, thinking he'd bought himself more time. My little half-sister Mia, 12 years old and sharper than any of us gave her credit for, cornered me in the hallway one evening and asked why I'd started locking my truck and why I kept driving out to the ranch alone after dark. I told her it was nothing. She didn't believe me, and she was right not to, but I couldn't put that weight on a 12-year-old, so I just told her that some things take time to fix properly, and left it at that. I drove out to the ranch alone the night before I was set to file the notice. I sat on the tailgate in the cold and looked at the fence line my father and I had repaired together, and for a while I let myself feel everything I'd been holding back for months. I wished he had lived long enough to see this land stay in the family without a fight. I wished Gerald had been the kind of stepfather who saw a grieving 21-year-old and simply loved him, instead of a man who saw an old widower's land and simply priced him. I wished my mother had protected what my father built instead of signing whatever was placed in front of her. But wishes don't hold up in court. Paper does. I cried out there in the dark, not from weakness, but because I finally understood, completely, what my father meant that summer evening with the brass key in my hand, and what he meant that Sunday on the east fence line when he told me to remember what kind of person I was. The filing was set for 11:50 that night, timed to Arthur's office system update, the night before Mia's birthday party, which Gerald had insisted on hosting at the ranch house itself, the same land he was trying to sell out from under us. I sat alone in my apartment with my laptop open, on a video call with Arthur, who walked me through the final document one more time, his voice calm, unhurried, the same tone he must have used with my father 4 years earlier. "Once you click submit," he said, "there's no version of this that gets undone by a phone call or a friendly conversation. This makes it permanent, on paper, the way your father wanted it." I clicked submit at 12:03 in the morning. Arthur said, "It's done. Your father would be glad it was you who finished it." I sat there for a long moment in the blue light of the screen, and I said out loud, to no one, "I am 29 years old. I am the sole owner of 40 acres my father protected for me before I even knew he needed to." Across town, in a dark house, Gerald was asleep, still believing the closing on the north pasture was 3 weeks away and entirely his to control. He would find out otherwise in about 11 hours. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button because this story is about to turn. The birthday party was already underway when Gerald's phone rang. I watched him step away from the grill to answer it, and I watched his face change in real time. First confusion, then something closer to panic, as the title company explained why the sale could not proceed. He came back inside, holding the phone like it had betrayed him personally. He pulled me aside near the kitchen, his voice low, and asked if I knew anything about some kind of trust. I told him, calmly, that the land had been mine since the day my father died, that everything had been filed and recorded exactly the way it was supposed to be, and that there was nothing left to discuss. He looked at me like I was still the 21-year-old he remembered mowing the lawn without complaint. I wasn't. I hadn't been for 4 years. My mother came in halfway through and went quiet, in a way I'd never seen from her, the kind of quiet that comes when you realize you signed something you shouldn't have. Gerald didn't yell. He didn't have anything left to say that would change what was already permanent. He just stood there in the kitchen, still holding a spatula, while 40 acres of paperwork finished doing what my father had set in motion 4 years before any of us knew we'd need it. Mia found me outside a little while later, sat next to me on the porch steps without saying anything for a long time, then finally asked if the ranch was going to be okay now. I told her yes. She nodded, like she'd already known. My mother found me by the truck, as people started to leave, still holding a paper plate she'd forgotten to set down. She asked, quietly, why I hadn't told her. I told her I didn't know how to tell her something that would make her choose between the man in her kitchen and the truth about him. She didn't argue with that. She just stood there for a moment, and then she said my father's name, just once, like she was testing whether it still hurt the same way it used to. I think for her, that day wasn't really about the land at all. It was about finally seeing, in plain daylight, the difference between the two men she had trusted with the same 40 acres. My father used to say that paper is the only thing that remembers what people forget. I used to think he meant something small, keep your receipts, read the fine print. He meant something much larger than that. He meant that love, if it's real, doesn't just live in memory, where it can be argued with or reinterpreted after you're gone. It lives in the things you put in place before anyone else knows they'll need them. Gerald tried, for a while, to salvage the version of himself he'd been performing for the family. Apologetic phone calls, a card on my birthday, an offer to let bygones be bygones over dinner I never attended. There was nothing left to salvage. Once my mother started asking her own questions about the accounts he'd been managing, the version of Gerald that had spent 4 years being agreeable started to disappear, along with the money he'd hoped to control. He sold the truck a year later and moved out not long after. Once it became clear, my mother's savings weren't his to manage either. My mother and I are still rebuilding something, slowly, on better terms than before. Arthur retired last spring and still sends me a card every year on the anniversary of my father's death. As for me, I still have the ranch, and the brass key still doesn't fit any lock in any house I've lived in, and I've never once thrown it away. I keep it on a hook by my own back door now. Some evenings I drive out there just to sit on the tailgate where I cried that one night, and I think about my father every time I check the fence line the way he taught me. And I think, some people leave you a name, he left me proof. If you've ever had to protect something quietly, without anyone knowing you were already 3 steps ahead, I want to hear your story. Tell me in the comments. And if this story moved you, subscribe. There are more to come.